In a global economy, knowing about the latest developments in different regions of the world is quite important, especially for a Sri Lankan business that is planning to take their business, their brand, global. Knowing about what's happening around is indeed vital. Today on Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, we will be focusing about the latest developments in the European Union, the latest political and economic developments which might be of importance to your decision making. I'm Tharundu Amarasekara, and joining me for this very insightful discussion is none other than Thorsten Bargfrede, who is currently the charge d'affaires of the European Union's delegation to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, as well as the head of trade, political and communication sector. Thorsten, Ayubowan, and welcome to Bisnomics.
Thank you very much.
Thorsten, let's talk about the current update in the European Union. As it emerges out of the pandemic, the impact would have probably been quite severe on the trade and the economic aspects, but I believe the recovery is looking equally brighter. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? It was a very hard year for all of us, and globally all over the world, and I believe most of the lockdown and also the consequences were even at least longer than in Sri Lanka, and the second wave, the third wave, that was really felt by businesses. And so all over the EU, the GDP fell by 6% last year. And of course, that is linked to the lockdowns that came with the pandemic measures. In some sectors, like hospitality or tourism, where you need face-to-face contact, even more, of course. But others, like finance, they were doing much better because they could switch to a teleworking mode. So, and of course, we have 27 member states. So in some countries, it was even worse. In Greece, GDP dropped by 10%, in Spain by 11%. So there are regional differences as well. We're looking now forward to the recovery. First, we put together a huge, unprecedented financial package. We call it the Next Generation EU. It's a total of 750 billion euros. It's the biggest investment package since the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. The focus of this plan is our shared priority as EU among all countries, which is green recovery, digitalization, digital and sustainable infrastructure, sustainable transport. These are sort of the joint projects that are Europe-wide that will be supported by that. So the prediction is that in 2021 growth will come back to 4.2%, and 2022 to 4.4%. That is Europe-wide. There, of course, will always be
different projects,
slight differences. Exactly. Yeah.
And Thorsten, let's talk about the diversity. They say the beauty is always in the diversity, but when it comes to drawing up a regional economic plan, surely it's not an easy task, because let's face it, we are looking at an economy of somewhere around $15 trillion as at 2020, and at the same time 27 different countries, 19 countries using a common currency, different political agendas, different economic agendas. How does the task of developing a common economic direction for the region really fit in amongst all this diversity?
It's not easy. But it's a way that we've chosen. In the 1950s, the European Union wasn't called that. It was the European Community for Coal and Steel. It only had 6 member states to join.
So the origins were from coal and steel?
Yes, because
wow, I did not know that.
The idea was that those 2 industries that are war necessary, that are war sensitive, that these are managed jointly, so there would never be a war between France and Germany again. So there was a peace building beginning in all that.
Peace through trade. Exactly,
and it was first by controlling these 2 industries only, and then it extended to an economic community. By 1992, we had a single market with 15 member states then. A single market means, of course, not only no tariffs, but also you need common standards. And that's where the politics come in. And it comes to what is hygiene or health standards wise the right thing. Some people thought, cheese should be made this way, and the others thought it should be made that way. And we overcame that with the common political structures. There's the European Parliament as a sovereign expression of the people directly, the Council with the member states, and frankly, it's a constant negotiation and decision-making process in Brussels. And of course, in 2005, we got the single currency, the euro. Now that, of course, made the market perfect in a way, because there was full transparency of the prices in the entire market with the euro. But of course, it also put more pressure on the productivity of countries. Other countries could not devalue anymore their currency if the productivity falls. So some regional differences come further to the front, as we saw with the Greek crisis a few years ago.
Yes.
But overall, since we sort of shared sovereignty in this way, we didn't, countries couldn't decide on a lot of things by themselves anymore. But actually, we gained sovereignty, because only together as 27, our voice matters in the world. So as EU, we are the biggest market in the world. We can set standards that others will copy, because they will want to have access to that market. If each country would have continued making their own decision, that wouldn't be the case. But of course, these differences still exist. So there's also, within the EU budget, we have regional funds and social funds to counter these sort of a redistribution of wealth in a way, so that the richer countries will indirectly support those regions that are underdeveloped. Some in the south, but also parts of Germany, or it depends, not in each country there are different regions that are traditionally less developed. So we try to tackle that as well, to come to a greater cohesion, in a way, of the various countries.
So I guess it's the age-old wisdom. If you want to go faster, go alone, but if you want to go further, go together. So I believe by the economies coming together, as a region, the aim is to go further.
Of course, and I think overall, everybody benefited from that. The productivity, of course, went up with the common market. It's such an attractive place of investment for outside investors as well, because it's not just one country. You can serve with that investment 27 countries in one market.
Mr. Bargfrede, let's talk about a key milestone, or I would say a turning point in the EU over the last decade, and that would be the Brexit. What has the impact of the Brexit been on the European Union's economy, and what are the highlights of the final deal that is there between the European Union and Britain?
So, since 1st of January 2021, our friends in Britain left the European Union, and the UK became a third country from an economic perspective. And this is governed by the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, this is an agreement that goes beyond what is in a standard free trade agreement, because it's not only talking about trade and goods, but also trade and services. It talks about digital trade, it governs intellectual property, public procurement, aviation, road transport, energy, fisheries, so a lot of things, not just trade and goods. Social security coordination, because there's sometimes, pensioners from one country living in the other, but also law enforcement and judicial cooperation will continue in criminal matters. So if a suspect goes over borders, there's still a good cooperation in getting behind him. Now, of course, it falls short of being in the common market or even in the customs union. And that we have seen potentially can lead to some problems, because the European Union, as a common market, we have an interest to protect our market borders. So, and that means there needs to be some sort of tariff control, there needs to be a quality control at this outside border.
For example, there's a lot of talk about the sausage wars.
There are the sausage wars, of course, yes, where, of course, the European Union, I would say, look, we have to look at your sausages, are they in line with our standards?
Correct.
We see it as well with fisheries. It's more difficult for British fishermen to sell their fish in the European market because of these extra standard hurdles.
And that explains the abandoned boats on the 1st of
Maybe,
January.
yeah. And of course there's the question of that agreement predicted that this, to prevent a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
The hard border.
The hard border, That tariff border was agreed to be in the sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And that is still not fully, the implementation of that is still needs to be sorted out, frankly, because obviously that's then becomes an inner UK border in a way.
There was some good news though recently about data flow, allowing the data to cross between the EU region as well as Britain without any tariffs or any such taxation issues. Am I right?
Data as an information.
Yes.
That's quite possible. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't think we have an agreement on financial services yet, because that's a key industry for Britain, of course, with London as a financial hub.
And we see Paris rediscovering itself as a potential financial
there are a number
hub
of
as well.
there are a number of European cities, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, who are
Vying for that, yes.
looking to get some business
Interesting
there, and no, and of course you see Turkey is still part of the customs union, although not part of the European Union.
Correct.
And so what we see is the effects for the moment of Brexit are harder on the UK in the sense that I think it's 20% or so less trade in the first 4 months of this year than in 2019. Some of it might be recovered with adaptation, etc.
Yes.
But overall, the impact is higher for the UK, of course, because the EU is and remains their biggest market.
Absolutely, biggest trading partner.
And if I may add, there's some irony that it was Margaret Thatcher who was pushing for the common market among all European leaders the hardest. So it was a 60-year struggle of Great Britain to not be disadvantaged towards the integration of Europe in economic terms.
Correct.
And now sort of decided to step one step back in a way.
Interesting developments there. We are going to talk about that more, Mr. Bargfrede. What about the European Union and Sri Lankan economic ties? Let's find out about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. We are in conversation with Thorsten Bargfrede, who is the charge d'affaires of the European Union delegation to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Mr. Bargfrede, now let's talk about the economic ties between Sri Lanka and the European region. Now, Sri Lanka considers European Union to be the second biggest business partner, trading partner after the US. How strong are these economic ties, and what about the past, the present, and the future potential for trade?
I think there's a solid relationship, and I think there is a great potential in the future as well. I mean, it started all 1975 with a commercial agreement, and since 95 we have an office here. We call it the EU Delegation, which works on development and trade matters, and now also political matters. And yeah, and of course since 2017 we have GSP Plus back, which improves the access to the European market and over 66 product lines. So where we stand now is that over the last 25 years the EU has grown to be an important partner of Sri Lanka in terms of exports, but also in terms of investments and in terms of provision of tourism. In all of these we are among the top 3 even after the exit of the UK. So just as a reminder, I mean, the European Union, even with 27 member states, remains the largest market in the world. 450 million consumers that are with a relatively high income. And so that is an important export market for Sri Lanka, of course. Yeah.
And Mr. Bargfrede, it's not only the trade aspect, isn't it? Because a lot of people may not know this, but the European Union delegation also supports a lot of local trade, local business, especially SMEs. Let's talk about that, the contribution that the European Union has been doing towards supporting the development and growth of some of the businesses in Sri Lanka.
Yes, I mean, alongside our concession of GSP Plus 2017, we also started a trade-related assistance program to help Sri Lankan companies to benefit more from GSP Plus, because what we saw is it's essentially big companies who export to Europe, mainly garment, of course, tea, rubber, things like that. So what we wanted is encourage small enterprises as well to find the market for the products in Europe. So we supported export development strategies in 6 key sectors, provided training courses, and generally tried to increase the flow of information to small companies as well. Now, beyond the trade factor, we also try to help through our rural development programs, because we see that self-employment in small companies are a key factor in developing also some of the poorer districts. So, for example, I was just in Uva province half a year ago to open a digital business center at the district administration, where people could come, register their companies without any paper, just through the internet or through digital means. And that's the sort of thing we like to see more, to help also small companies in Sri Lanka to grow, because that's always the key challenge for a smaller company.
Let's talk about I would say, let's address the elephant in the room, GSP Plus, because there's a lot of talk about it. It was a big boost to especially our apparel sector and some of the key exports when this was granted again back in 2017. But there is a talk about this GSP Plus facility being taken back. And there's a lot of recent discussions in the European Union Parliament as well. Any update on this that you could share with us, Mr. Bargfrede?
Well, I mean, I can just, to start with, share the basics. GSP Plus is a unilateral concession from the European Union to increase the market access beyond the standard GSP provisions under international trade. And we see it as a sustainable development tool, because it helps countries that are not rich, so it only applies for lower middle income countries, not upper middle income countries. And in exchange, we want to see that a number of international conventions, 27 in the area of human rights, labor rights, environment, are ratified and implemented. And it's important to note that these 27 conventions, for example, Sri Lanka has all ratified anyway. These are commitments Sri Lanka made towards the international community, the UN. It's not imposed by us.
It's nothing new. It's nothing extra.
It's nothing new. It's nothing new. Sri Lanka would need to implement these anyway, even without GSP Plus. That's not a new sort of condition on it. And of course, there's a regular monitoring mechanism. I mean, the last time, every 2 years, there's a report written by the European Commission, our executive, to the European Parliament and to the European Council, where our member states sit. The last report was written and published in January 2020. The next one is expected in around the same time, in January 2022, early 2022. So we have a continued monitoring, but the aim now will be to see where progress is in the next few months, so we can then start drafting with that report that will then go to the Parliament sort of early next year. The way we do this is through a continuous cooperation with the government and discussion with the government. We also talk with other stakeholders, with trade unions, with employers' organizations, with civil society. And we hope to have a more formal sort of monitoring mission coming in as well, sometimes in autumn. But that might have to be virtual depending on the conditions. So that's how it looks like. Yeah, it's an ongoing monitoring, essentially.
Understood. Now, when the European Union is looking at a potential trading partner, what are the key characteristics that they are looking at? I mean, if you take, for example, a country, as you very correctly said, areas like human rights, areas like how well the development is taking place from a human perspective, the Human Development Index details, etc. But what are the main developments you're looking at when the European Union is looking at another country as a potential trading partner?
In terms of trade policy, let's start there more directly. I think what is really important for the European Union is a trade order based on multilateralism and based on rules. And so primarily there is the World Trade Organization and its rules, and it's very important for us that partners abide by these rules. And that hence there's a predictability. And that's also where we have some concerns recently with the import restriction in Sri Lanka, to be honest, because we see that there are some problems with the foreign exchange situation in Sri Lanka, but
I
nevertheless,
think it's safe to say big problems.
I won't comment on that. But just our point is that's if you feel you have to do import restriction, follow the rules, and the rules say you have to notify the World Trade Organization, and that has not happened yet. I would also point out that there are risks with that strategy beyond the legal considerations, so to say, is of course that prices will go up. If you put restrictions on agricultural products, prices for agricultural products will go up. That is logical. And normally this can hit the poorest hardest, who spend most of their income on food. There's also the question of predictability for investors. For an investor from Europe, certainly predictability of rules is very important, because an investment is something that is long-term. If then rules change short-term, and that is a problem for a European investor. In addition, I think it's also important to be reliable, so that if rules are established, even that they stay the same and don't change from one day to another. And of course that there's no discrimination from an investor viewpoint.
For sure.
And compared to the local investors, that people are treated separately, equally.
And if you look at some of the economic policies of Sri Lanka, we've seen the major problem of inconsistency, where sometimes every 5 years the rules tend to change, the policies tend to change. What do you think this can have an impact on the relations between Sri Lanka and not just EU, but with any global economic partner? When you look at the exports, the imports, etc., the policies keep changing very regularly. So we do see a policy inconsistency to a certain extent. Do you think this puts the Sri Lankan economy on a negative footing?
I believe, let's put it this way, I believe it's in the interest of Sri Lanka to stay open as an economy. If the vision that we hear from various governments is that Sri Lanka should develop as a hub, as a transport hub, as an economic hub, a hub needs to be open. This is what we learned from our port cities as well in Europe. To be attractive as a port, goods need to flow in and out.
Cities like Rotterdam.
You need to be Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg. You need to be open to the world. That's in a way it's quite logical, and it's important that there's predictability. Of course, I mentioned it before. Shifts in policy is never great for attracting investments, I think.
And excessive blocking of imports can lead to certain retaliations from some of the key export markets as well. Am I right? As EU, we only follow WTO rules. We would never bilaterally retaliate outside the multilateral trading system. But of course, if the notifications don't come in, at some point the EU will also raise its point at the World Trade Organization. Mr. Bargfrede, let's discuss a point you mentioned earlier. You were mentioning about the office, and you said when the trade comes in, so does the politics. How do these two go hand in hand, especially when EU is working with a particular partner nations, for example, Sri Lanka? How does trade and politics go hand in hand? I'm asking this for a very simple reason, and let me be very open with you here, because there's a common complaint from certain parties, and this is not only for the EU, this applies for so many different economic powerhouses, that through the name of economics they try to drive a political agenda. But what would you say to that, and how does politics and trade get balanced off in this sense?
I mean, to be very clear, the European Union is a diplomatic actor, and so we have no preferences as such with the color of the government we are working with. We work with countries, not with governments primarily. So
good point.
So there is we are absolutely neutral there. There's no politics in that. So I mean, and when it comes to trade, even less, I would say, because the EU stands for an open trading system, for a rules-based multilateral system, and so we will not direct our companies in this way or the other way because of politics. We believe in a market-based economy, and hence it
open and fair for all.
Open and fair for all, and it's the companies who make decisions of where they want to export, where they want to buy, and where they want to invest. The European Union has very little role in guiding them, frankly, apart from broad and their politics come in, broad strategic priorities, like green recovery, the green revolution, digitalization. These are things where we feel within Europe, but also outside. We would encourage companies to say, look at this direction, see how you become more sustainable and that sort of thing.
Interesting. How do you see the European Union managing and handling the current, some of the global security threats that you see? Because today, let's admit, some of the security threats, like for example terrorism, is not just limited to one country. We experience the brunt of it here in Sri Lanka, and we also see attacks happening in so many places around the world, and EU is not alone in this problem.
Absolutely.
And how do you see this threat being addressed as a union?
For us, it was a big challenge. It's of course, we had terror attacks in nearly all of our member states, so we were very saddened when we saw the terror attacks here. Europeans died as well, but not only, we wanted to show some solidarity with Sri Lanka as well, so we started some cooperation on counterterrorism through the UN since over a year to support the Sri Lankan authorities in addressing that problem, really. Yeah? And for us, as European Union, we are a value-based actor as well. It's important for us that security and human rights go hand in hand. We don't think there's a trade-off. We don't necessarily think that by giving suspects the human rights they deserve, that you increase your security risk. We feel that sometimes it's a challenge, quite honestly, when you look at returning fighters from Syria who want to come back to Europe. What do you do? And it's difficult. There are difficult
tough choices.
Yeah, tough choices sometimes. But we feel in the long run it's absolutely important that security is provided while keeping human rights intact, of course, also of the suspects.
Interesting point. What developments do we see in the European Union, and what are the key upcoming economic sectors to look into? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Thorsten Bargfrede, who is the Charge d'Affaires of the European Union Delegation to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Mr. Bargfrede, let's talk about the future potential areas of the European Union. Where do you see, in what sectors of the EU do you see the biggest development? Because I'm asking this, we have so many students who go to the European region, they engage in studies, and then they venture out into their own careers in the EU, and there are so many Sri Lankans who have very successfully established themselves in the EU as well, which brings us a lot of proudness as well on that factor. But in which sectors do you think the biggest opportunities will be in the European Union over the next few years?
I think it's difficult to point at one sector only, because there are many opportunities in many sectors, from services, finances will continue, tourism as well in Europe. But of course, if I would have to choose one, it probably would be the green revolution, I might call it. It's sort of the green recovery, the Green Deal, we call it within the EU policy area, because the push towards sustainable production, that will be unstoppable in the European Union. We made a commitment to, by 2050, not to be climate neutral, and that will have a lot of consequences for businesses as well, I think. There will be opportunities in everything green as well for Sri Lankan exporters. I think there would be a chance here to, when it comes to fair trade, bio products, organic production. There, Sri Lanka, I could see, could have a certain competitive value as well, and an advantage with a relatively high labor and environmental standards compared to other countries in the region. So the focus on quality that Sri Lankans could have as well, compared to the cheaper production in the neighborhood, frankly, I think there would be a market for that as well in the European Union. Also, the focus on quality that Sri Lankan producers could look at would be important, compared to only try to be competitive about the price, like some of the bigger neighboring countries. Yeah,
Mr. Bargfrede, the climate change conference, or what we call as the Paris Agreement. Now, so many European member countries are important stakeholders of this agreement. From a policy perspective, you did mention a few pointers earlier, but from a more policy perspective, how do you see the green agenda being driven across the entire European Union?
Well, one thing Europeans are thinking about is to sort of balance the fact that some countries are champions in low emission production already or want to go faster, like the European Union. There's a risk, of course, that then some of the industries would say, well, hang on, this is getting more expensive here. I'd rather go somewhere else.
And they lose that advantage.
And so not only the investor goes to another spot, but also the carbon emissions might increase and not be lower, which is the intention of European policies in that direction. So there is, at the conceptual stage, the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. That would need to be compatible with the World Trade Organization, but it essentially means that a producer who produces in a less clean, green economy might have to pay an adjustment when entering the European market. The details are still not sorted out, but that is sort of one of the strategic broad ideas that will have a real impact. There's also a new drive on carbon credit market development that come out of the Paris Agreement.
What exactly was that about, this carbon credit market development? Where there's a lot of talk about it.
The idea is, I think, that the various allowances given to countries under the Paris Agreement, that these could be traded in a certain way, and so that those who don't use them could at least put them into an economic system where they can get reimbursed for it. That also leads a bit to a debate about green finance that is coming up. We see, for example, that on stock markets, etc., green companies and green funds, in a way, are doing particularly well because there's a demand for it.
The green bonds.
Sort of, yes, yeah.
And how do you see the innovation taking shape in Europe? Because we all know many decades ago, when the manufacturing shifted towards the Asian markets, for example, China, and then later on to Vietnam, etc., we saw how Europe was more focused on innovation. Any comments about the current innovation engine in the European region and any agenda of the EU to drive this innovation engine forward?
Look, at the EU side, we have a broad support mechanism we call Horizon 2020.
Horizon 2020.
That is also open for third countries. That is open for Sri Lankan researchers as well, which supports research partnerships and hence innovation within Europe across borders, but also outside. So partners from Sri Lanka are invited to, with European partners, present innovative research projects to bring this forward. But traditionally, innovation very often came as well through small and medium enterprises. You mentioned it before. Like where I'm from in Germany, it's the medium enterprises who are really the driving engine of our export industry.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Mittelstand?
The Mittelstand, exactly, yes. Sort of sometimes very specialized in a particular piece, but then being the world leader on that particular piece, and so it's not necessarily driven by the huge companies, and so innovation doesn't require necessarily, large structures. The first vaccine, to my knowledge, was a small biotech company close to Frankfurt.
Correct.
The Pfizer. BioNTech, yeah. And so, these things are possible in Europe as well. It's not only across the Atlantic that we see innovation.
I want to come to that since you mentioned, and I could not ignore the wry smile you had when you mentioned it. The relations between the EU region and the US under Biden administration. Now, we saw a bit of fire, I would say a lot of fire pouting from both ends during the Trump administration, but now we are looking at a new Biden administration. How do you see the contrast?
Well, the contrast is visible, of course. It's what we see now with the new U.S. administration, that is coming back to the values of multilateral approaches to international order, frankly.
Starting with the signing of the Paris Agreement again?
Signing with the signing of the Paris Agreement, very important, but also more generally working through partners, working through international organizations, using the UN as a fora versus doing everything bilateral. That is sort of, in that way, this administration comes closer to where the EU values are, and probably closer where EU interests are as well, to some extent, in the sense that there was also a protectionist element in the previous administration, and so we see now there is again more ability to talk about free trade together, and yeah.
Interesting. Let's talk about the work of your mission, the European Union delegation to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. What kind of work was it involved in, especially during the COVID-19 time, in terms of supporting the businesses and supporting the Sri Lankan economy? What kind of activities were taking place? And what exactly is the mandate and the mission of this delegation?
Look, we do a lot of things, actually. We started as a delegation of the European Commission, primarily looking at development aid. As a development partner, we have, in the last 20 years, or the last 10 years, I think, spent more than 800 million euros, and that's all in grants, no conditions attached. We are a grant donor primarily. We are increasingly also becoming an investment donor and a financial donor through the European Investment Bank. But primarily we are working on grants. So that was always there. That was trade policy was always there as well as an EU core competence. Since the Lisbon Treaty, since 2009, the EU also has a foreign common and security policy that is backed up by a foreign service. That's why I'm working. So the European delegation essentially works like an embassy that combines development support, that combines trade policy with coordination of European member states on political and foreign policy issues, and so that's quite a development over time as well in what our role was. And so in COVID times, of course, these some of these roles came to play. Sort of, we were trying to keep the information flow going between Europe and Sri Lanka on best COVID practices and what is happening. But we also managed to reallocate some of our funds, and 22 million euro were used as a support to Sri Lanka to tackle COVID. Parts of that, and since it had to be quick, we looked at existing projects we have, and so some went to small agricultural businesses in the Uva province I mentioned before. We had a project there. We gave support to the tourism industry, very important, not as direct grants necessarily, but also to support the revival once the tourism industry can kick off again.
Interesting.
And yeah.
Mr. Bargfrede, let's also talk about some of the supply chain concerns, because as we all know, Rotterdam, the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands is a key port, not only for the country, but also for the entire region. And we've been hearing so much of news, and this is not only limited just for Rotterdam, but I guess across the business map, we see so many ports having such a big backlog of containers to be cleared, ships to be cleared, because of some of the backlog of the production work that happened during the pandemic, which is now trying to get cleared in one snap.
Yeah.
But if you look at some of those blocks of the supply chain, clearly it's having an economic impact. What are your thoughts on the impact of the supply chain blocks in the European region?
Very difficult to untangle. You see, the European Union relies to 90% of maritime trade for the goods that come in and out of Europe. Well, not internally within the EU, but
yes.
World trade relies on shipment.
And I believe it's a few cities that actually have access to the seaports, Rotterdam being one of them.
Rotterdam, Hamburg, Antwerp, and others further south. But the big trend, of course, is huge container ships. And there you just have a handful who are able to handle these. And what we see in the last few months, if I'm not mistaken, is a doubling or tripling of container transport prices. That, of course, is very tricky because it rises prices everywhere for doing business and for trading.
Leads to global inflation.
And it's very difficult to untangle because it's linked to an unequal recovery to some extent from the COVID pandemic. While some regions open up, production goes full to pre-COVID levels, some of their markets are not ready yet. And some areas open faster than others, some ports open faster than others, and so there is these imbalances will not easily untangle during the year. That will probably stay for a little while, these higher transport prices.
On a final note, I want to ask you, Sri Lanka has a very important strategic position in the global business map because of the geography. This also means that we have so many different nations wanting to have a piece of the action or to be involved in the economic activities. Unfortunately, sometimes we see some of those collaborations come with very dangerous requests where we sometimes have to compromise some of our economic positions. When Sri Lanka picks a trading partner, a global trading partner, what should we be careful of? I know this is a very tricky question and I don't want you to mention exact names, etc. But when Sri Lanka is looking at a potential partnership with another country, how can we make sure that it's Sri Lanka's interests first?
Well, of course, I think transparency is important. So also that reliability. And so it's important to to also be transparent about what these deals are.
Correct. Sometimes we see the
this is how you build trust in a way.
Yes.
The other element, of course, I think it's probably wise not to rely on one partner only, but to be open and have as many partners as possible, and from various directions.
Because we've seen a trend where sometimes they say, okay, we'll give you a financial support, but whatever projects you do has to go to companies from our country, which I don't think is the way forward for economic partnership and development.
I think the key is, especially when it comes to very high-level investment projects, there needs to be an economic profitability in the long run. It needs to be clear that this is a benefit to the economy of the country, and that needs to be demonstrated. I think that's sound decision making, right?
Absolutely. Our focus today was on the Sri Lanka and European Union economic ties, and also we discussed so many different matters and topics related to this. I'm indeed thankful to Mr. Thorsten Bargfrede, who is currently the chargé d'affaires of the European Union delegation to Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Mr. Bargfrede, thank you so much for spending time with us. We touched on so many different aspects and so many vital topics and points. I'm quite sure the audience found it extremely insightful. Thank you for your time and wishing you and your mission all the very best to keep up the good work continuing.
Thank you. It was a pleasure being here.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode of Bisnomics. No matter what business you may be in, have a profitable week ahead. I'll see you with the next episode.